It's just that I've been lying to myself for all this. Look, I gotta admit something, okay? While a major focus of this YouTube channel has been and will continue to be Apple computers, I just gotta say it. I'm secretly a closeted PCMR gamer. It feels so good to get that off my chest. That's right. In fact, for the first time ever, I currently own more Windows PCs than I do Macs. I don't really like Windows, necessarily, although I don't actually hate it as much as I joke. It's just that if you want to play PC games in 2020, a Mac isn't really even an option. Unless you have this. And who has this? What is this? Why is my shirt wet? Look, when I was growing up in the mid-90s, PC gaming was experiencing its heyday. And it's my perception from articles I've read and from older generations that I've talked to, that console gaming was really king in the 1980s. Whilst PC hardware was more powerful than console rivals, it just didn't have the software catalog to provide that at-home arcade experience quite like, say, an NES. But in 1993, Doom was released on PCs, and it was revolutionary. State of the art. Never before had a console game come close in terms of graphical fidelity, controls, and level design. With the release of Wolfenstein 3D, Unreal, Diablo 2, and Half-Life, the PC's 3D accelerators continued to show their technical dominance. And what a lot of people don't know is that the Mac was actually viewed as a viable alternative to the Windows gaming PC. Now, sure, most of the games on Mac were ports from Windows, but Apple did have a few notable firsts, such as the puzzle game Myst and Marathon. The latter was developed by Mac-focused game development studio Bungie. That's right, that Bungie. In fact, Halo was originally unveiled by Steve Jobs as a Mac exclusive at Macworld 1999, before Microsoft went yoink. Even after Microsoft had purchased Bungie, Halo Combat Evolved did actually end up on Mac as promised, albeit 2 years late. Thanks a lot, Microsoft. Unfortunately, Steve Jobs famously disliked video games, so when he returned to Apple in the late 90s, they shifted their focus away from desktop gaming. More recently, Apple has refocused on gaming, but mobile gaming via iOS and its derivatives. Remember when Apple tried to convince us that gaming on Apple TV was going to be a thing? But look, Apple's efforts haven't been wasted, as mobile gaming surpassed console and PC gaming total revenue in 2019. That's insane. That is a lot of money. Speaking of money, Raid Shadow... I'm just kidding, but that's a perfect example, because Apple gets a huge chunk of this income, as 30% of all purchases made on the iOS platform go straight into Apple's pockets. With the addition of services like the $5 per month Apple Arcade subscription, one thing is more true than ever. Apple likes money. And while they're not a traditional gaming company, I would not put it past them to expand into new territories if dollar bills are up for grabs. And yes, I'm talking, of course, about this rumor that Apple is going to be making a gaming PC. On the offset, I think this rumor is absolute bunk, and not because of the hardware, because that's technically the easy part. While AMD is crushing it in the CPU game lately, and more game titles are starting to take advantage of hexa-core and octa-core CPUs, Intel's quad-core CPUs are still respectable enough for most modern gaming titles. In the GPU department, however, Apple could really repair its damaged relationship with NVIDIA. Let me put it this way. In 2018, I was running Far Cry 5 on my MacBook Pro with an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti in an eGPU enclosure. And today, in 2020, my $6,000 Mac Pro can't match that same gaming performance, and none of Apple's computers can until you're willing to shell out the money for this, the AMD W5700X for Mac Pro. Look, I've shown in my prior videos of Mac Pro that you can install basically any macOS supported GPU you'd like, thanks to the fact that Mac Pro has regular old PCIe slots. And for the not so small price of $69.95, you too can be the proud owner of one of these, an auxiliary power cable kit which supplies additional juice to your GPU of choice. I had intended to ditch the crappy 580X that came with my Mac Pro in favor of a third-party AMD RX 5700 XT. But I ran into a few problems. For one, my computer was no longer very quiet because unlike Apple's GPUs, which have massive heat sinks on them and are cooled by the 3 fans at the front of Mac Pro, my pedestrian consumer GPU was a little bit louder than I expected and caused quite a ruckus in such a quiet machine. Secondly, and more importantly, because normal GPUs don't support Apple's display stream compression over Thunderbolt 3, I couldn't use the LG Ultrafine 5K display, which I am quite fond of. Though I should mention, regular DisplayPort monitors work just fine on other GPUs. So, because the 580X GPU that comes with the $6,000 Mac Pro is a literal abomination, but I didn't find myself itching to spend $2,800 for the Vega 2 GPU, I spent $1,000 after waiting a few months on this puppy, the W5700X. Now, before you cry wolf saying, well, Apple's just ripping off customers because that's basically a rebranded RX 5700 XT, which you can get for less than half the cost. You're only partially correct. The W5700X, importantly, doubles the memory of the 5700 XT, bringing it to a total of 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 NVRAM. Though unlike the Vega offerings from AMD and Apple, this GPU doesn't feature ECC memory correction. Now, $1,000 sounds like a lot, but AMD charges $800 for the W5700, which has 4 fewer compute units and half the VRAM. So surprisingly, Apple's pricing on this thing is actually really reasonable. Sure, it's not a gaming card and is obviously intended for compute tasks, but since it shares so much DNA with the 5700 XT, which in all respects is a pretty great mid-range gaming GPU, this should perform quite well. And it does. It blows away the performance I had on the 580X GPU, and quite frankly, Apple should just discontinue that thing because it is an embarrassment on a $6,000 computer. So, it only took 2 years and $7,000, but now I finally have a computer that can outperform my MacBook Pro with eGPU from 2018. Oh, ouch. Now, I'll give credit where it's due. AMD GPUs have come a long way in the last couple of years, but there's a reason NVIDIA still has 75% market share. And it's not just because green is a better color than red. The rumors state that this alleged gaming computer from Apple could cost up to $5,000. If that's the case, it can't have an Intel CPU, and it certainly can't have an AMD GPU. Sorry. But Quinn, you ask, isn't Apple working on ARM-based Macs? And this, my friends, is the biggest reason that I believe this rumor to be BS. Moving to a new architecture is difficult enough, and while porting x86 games to ARM has proven possible, see Nintendo's Switch, Apple's alleged gaming computer just wouldn't have the same number of unit sales nor the attach rate per game, which makes porting from PC to Mac ARM basically worthless for any developer. Let's pretend for a minute that ARM Macs aren't coming, or that Apple develops some impossibly good x86 to ARM translation layer that has no degradation in performance. It still makes no sense, because the hardware, which we've discovered isn't very easy after all, is the easy part. Software is where things get really tricky. Yeah, so nearly all of Apple's decisions over the last year or two would indicate that they don't give a crap about gaming on macOS. Now, a lot of people complain that Apple had decided to officially deprecate OpenGL with macOS Catalina, but that's not really a problem because Apple hadn't updated macOS's OpenGL support since 2010. Rather than continue to support this aging API, Apple developed Metal, which is similar to DirectX available on Windows, both of which are lower level and have low overhead access for hardware graphics acceleration. And Metal is, honestly, pretty great. Shadow of the Tomb Raider running on my fancy new W5700X GPU performs pretty closely on macOS using Metal to Windows using DirectX via Boot Camp. The problem is this. Like DirectX, Metal is not cross-platform, unlike OpenGL and Vulkan. Now, Microsoft can get away with it because of their enormous market share, but Apple just doesn't have that pull. On one hand, a studio that specializes in porting games to several platforms said the following: Metal is cool, but it is a closed source thing. But one thing you should keep in mind is that the renderer component is usually 5% of the code of the game, sometimes even less. So porting DirectX to Metal is very easy so long as Apple continues to update and provide necessary capabilities. On the other hand, this still requires work and money, which for, say, indie studios or independent developers is a problem. While OpenGL apps continue to work on macOS, there's no telling when Apple will pull the plug and remove it. Some developers have been very vocal about this, while others, like Andy Wood from Feral Interactive, and they make some pretty great games, said the following: It has been a challenge to work with OpenGL for years now, especially with the advent of new graphics technologies. For example, we weren't able to release F1 2015 on the Mac because OpenGL didn't have the necessary features. Feral Interactive proved their point by releasing F1 2017 for Mac using Metal. It was released on the same day as the Windows version, which is pretty awesome. I think the biggest problem, however, is the fact that in macOS Catalina, Apple decided to remove support for 32-bit libraries, which broke support for most of the very few games that supported macOS in the first place. And with such low sales numbers on Mac, most of these developers have elected to just not update their old games to work with 64-bit macOS Catalina, which further slims down the already very tiny and dated Mac games catalog. Releasing a new Mac gaming computer in its current environment just wouldn't work. So what could Apple do? You see, there's a bit of a catch-22 here, because nobody will publish games for your system if you have no market share, but your market share won't increase if you have no games. You know that phrase, you gotta spend money to make money? Console manufacturers are all too familiar with this because, for example, hardware on the Xbox and PlayStation are nearly identical lately. They compete with titles, games that they pay big money for to be exclusive to their respective platforms. If Apple spent money, and they'd need to spend a lot, to get an exclusive title, or at least a window of exclusivity for certain titles on their new gaming platform, they'd move units. Imagine if Apple and Rockstar announced that the all-new GTA 6 was going to be available exclusively on macOS through Apple's game store. You think they'd move units? Yeah, me too. There's also a little company Apple has had a really strange relationship with named Valve. Ever heard of them? Despite Apple's really small market share, Valve has continued to work with Apple over the years, bringing Steam to macOS, the entire Valve software catalog, and even Steam VR support to the Mac, despite basically none of Apple's computers being able to really run it. It's been even reported, although from Digitime, so this is very sketchy, that Apple and Valve are working together to launch Apple's upcoming AR headset. Hang with me here. You see, Apple and Valve share a common rival, Microsoft. It's pretty obvious with the release of Windows 10s and the upcoming Windows 10X that Microsoft wants to take an Apple-style walled garden approach by pushing software sales, that means games, through the Microsoft Store, which jeopardizes Valve's entire business. To combat this and to decouple the Windows requirement from software they sell, Valve has developed Proton for Linux, which you may not have heard of, but it's super amazing. Proton is an open source compatibility layer that allows software designed for Windows to run on Linux-based OSs, thanks to Wine and a direct 3D to Vulkan translation layer called DXVK. What does this all mean? Well, the Steam client on Linux can utilize Proton to play Windows games on Linux, even when there isn't a Linux version available. So hang with me here. Valve wants to lessen its dependence on Windows, and Apple wants to steal gaming market share from Windows. I can see a scenario in which Apple either buys Valve outright for a few $1 billion, or partners up with them to allow something similar to Proton via Wine and Metal for macOS. If Apple could instantly have tens of thousands of popular games with high reliability and offer exclusive games not available on Windows, the idea of a gaming Mac doesn't seem so impossible after all. Especially if, thanks to their partnership with Valve, users could bring over their existing software catalog. Apple and Valve would both take a cut of software sales, obviously, and more competition would exist, which means us consumers get more choice, fairer prices, and the freedom to game where and how we want. Then again, Valve's Gabe Newell said the following in 2007, quote, "So Apple seems to think they want to do gaming, but there's never any follow-through on any of the things they say they're going to do. That makes it hard to be excited about doing games for their platform." As much as I really don't think this is going to happen, I sure wish it would, because in order to get a remotely good AAA experience on a Mac, you'll either need to utilize an eGPU, which is janky and doesn't support NVIDIA cards anymore, or spend $7,000 and then still boot camp into Windows to get the performance of a, I don't know, $2,000 PC? Quite frankly, a disgrace. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Would you game on a Mac? And what would Apple have to do to stand out from the rest of the pack? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you didn't, that other button seems to work okay too. Get subscribed for more awesome tech videos like this one, but most importantly, and as always, stay snazzy. See you later, folks.